Imagine you find this ancient, dusty manuscript.
Mhm.
You're carefully opening the heavy cover, and you're looking at words written by a devout Christian monk who is furiously defending his faith.
Right.
But as you read this really elegant, sweeping script, you realize something completely mind-bending. He isn't quoting the Bible to make his points. He's actually using the Islamic Qur'ān.
Yeah, which is just incredible.
It is. He's quoting ancient Greek philosophers.
Right.
He's writing out Hebrew words, but like using the Arabic alphabet. And when you flip to the very end to see when this was written, he hasn't dated it from the birth of Jesus. He has dated his work using the Islamic calendar. Welcome to the deep dive.
It's basically the ultimate historical puzzle.
Huh.
You know, you are holding a document that completely shatters our modern assumptions about how different religions and cultures interacted in the past.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are going on a massive journey today. Our roadmap is focused on a highly unique 12th century manuscript known as Sinai R 434.
That's right.
And through this single fascinating text, which we're exploring, thanks to the brilliant academic work of Claire Wilde in her paper on Christological debates in the Hijri Mediterranean, we are going to explore a much larger question.
And that question is, how do human beings adapt their deepest intellectual arguments, their very identities, really, when the entire sociopolitical world shifts beneath their feet?
Exactly. We're going to look at how a person learns the language of their conquerors, not to surrender, but to actually fight back intellectually.
And to truly understand this manuscript, you know, we can't just look at the words on the page. We have to start with the physical place where it was written and, well, more importantly, where it was hidden for centuries. We have to talk about the vault.
Right. And vault is the perfect word. Picture the landscape of the southern Sinai Peninsula. You are standing near Jabal Musa, surrounded by absolute extremes.
Oh, yeah.
The air is bone dry, the sun is just relentless, the terrain is nothing but jagged mountainous rock, and rising out of that harshness is a fortress.
Literally a fortress.
Yes. It has high, impenetrable stone walls. It looks exactly like a military outpost designed to withstand a brutal siege, but it isn't. This is St. Catherine's Monastery.
It is a place where time sort of seems to fold in on itself. It sits right on the traditional site of the burning bush, so the exact geographic location where Moses is said to have received the Ten Commandments.
Wow.
But beyond its biblical significance, St. Catherine's holds another, arguably even more important title for our purposes today. Inside those massive fortress walls is the world's oldest continuously operating library.
And the sheer historical weight of this library just cannot be overstated. It was established by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian way back in the 6th century. So we were talking about an institution that has been collecting, copying, and preserving human thought for a millennium and a half.
Yeah, the scale of what they have inside is almost difficult to comprehend. To put its significance into perspective, its collection of ancient historical manuscripts is surpassed in the entire world by only one other institution.
Which is the Vatican.
Exactly, the Vatican Library in St. Catherine's.
I always find that comparison totally mind-boggling. I mean, think about the logistics of that. The Vatican is the bureaucratic and spiritual center of a global empire of faith, located right in the middle of Rome, which is one of the most historically powerful cities on earth.
Right.
So it makes total sense that they would have an unparalleled archive. But St. Catherine's is in the middle of a literal desert. It requires an arduous, dangerous trek just to get to the front door.
And, you know, that geographical isolation is precisely why the library is so phenomenal. The harsh desert environment naturally preserves fragile things like parchment and vellum.
Ah, right, the dry air.
Exactly. But more than the climate, you have a community of monks who have guarded these texts with a level of protectiveness that honestly borders on absolute paranoia.
But hang on, let me play devil's advocate for a second. Monasteries are generally supposed to be places of hospitality, right? Welcoming the weary traveler, sharing wisdom. Why are these specific monks so incredibly paranoid about who gets to see their books?
Well, because history has taught them a very bitter lesson. They learned the hard way that outsiders, especially educated European scholars who came knocking on their door, claiming to just want to, study, could not always be trusted.
Okay, this brings us to one of the most wild historical anecdotes we have in our notes today. It involves a 19th century German biblical scholar named Konstantin Tischendorf. Walk us through what happened here, because it perfectly explains the monastery's lockdown.
So Tischendorf was an academic who made it his life's mission to find the oldest possible manuscripts of the Bible. In the 1840s, he makes the incredibly difficult journey across the desert to St. Catherine's.
Okay.
He gets inside, and according to his own written account, he happens to walk past a basket in the middle of the monastery. And inside this basket, waiting to be used as kindling for the monastery's ovens, he claims he finds leaves of parchment containing the oldest complete copy of the New Testament in Greek.
Stop right there. A basket of kindling. I mean, are we really supposed to believe that monks who have guarded a library for 1,300 years are just casually tossing a priceless 4th century biblical manuscript into the fire to bake their daily bread?
Yeah, it is highly, highly disputed. The monks of St. Catherine's absolutely deny this ever happened. Modern historians tend to view Tischendorf's kindling story as a very convenient, self-serving justification for what he did next.
Oh, I see.
Because if he frames it as a rescue mission like, I saved this priceless artifact from ignorant monks who were going to burn it, it makes his subsequent actions look heroic rather than predatory.
Right, it's the classic 19th century imperialist framing. These locals don't know the value of their own history, so I, the enlightened European, must take it. So what exactly does he do?
He essentially manages to convince the monks to let him borrow the manuscript, which we now call the Codex Sinaiticus. He takes it back to Europe, supposedly to copy it and study it, with the explicit promise that it would be returned to its rightful home at St. Catherine's.
And let me guess, the borrowing period just conveniently kept getting extended.
Indefinitely. The manuscript ended up in the hands of the Russian Tsar, and eventually, in the 1930s, the Soviet government sold it to the British Museum for a massive sum of money.
That is just absolute audacity. Hey, mind if I just borrow the oldest complete New Testament in existence? I'll bring it right back, promise.
Yeah?
And over 2 centuries later, it still hasn't returned. It sits in the British Library today. Honestly, if I were a monk at St. Catherine's and someone pulled a heist like that on my watch, I would lock the heavy iron doors, throw away the key, and never let another academic inside again.
Which is exactly the policy they adopted. It explains their legendary secrecy perfectly. If the most precious artifact in your possession is taken under the guise of academic borrowing, you shut down all access. You treat every visitor as a potential thief.
But there is a silver lining to that intense paranoia, isn't there?
Yes, there is. The library was largely closed off to the outside world, which means the remaining manuscripts survived. They were locked away, safe from the elements, safe from wars, and, most importantly, safe from sticky-fingered scholars. This isolation acted as a time capsule.
But obviously, we're talking about one of their manuscripts today, Sinai R 434. So if the doors are locked, how do modern scholars even know what's in there?
Occasionally, and only under very specific, highly controlled circumstances, the doors were cracked open just a little bit. One of the major breakthroughs happened in 1949 and 1950.
Post-World War II.
Exactly. In the wake of the war, there was a global movement to preserve cultural heritage. The monks allowed an expedition sponsored by the Library of Congress to enter. But the crucial difference was that these researchers were absolutely not allowed to take the books.
No borrowing this time.
No borrowing. They brought in heavy, state-of-the-art camera equipment and were permitted only to photograph and microfilm the holdings.
So look, but don't touch.
Precisely. Then again, in 1968, after the Israeli occupation of the Sinai Peninsula during the Six-Day War, Israeli researchers were allowed in to photograph the remainder of the collection. And that microfilm, those delicate black and white negatives captured in the middle of the 20th century, is how modern scholars are able to study texts like Sinai R 434 today.
Amazing.
Yeah, they can scroll through the digitized images without ever having to breach the fortress walls or risk damaging the original parchment.
Okay, so we have established the scene. We know exactly where this text was kept. We know the intense paranoia surrounding its protection, and we know how we managed to get a digitized copy of it.
Right.
Now we need to dive into the actual text of Sinai R 434. The microfilm of this specific 255-folio manuscript was completed on May 31st, 1950. But the words on those pages take us back centuries earlier.
The manuscript itself is a collection of Christian homiletic writings. In the text, these are entitled mimars, which comes from a Syriac and Arabic word meaning sayings or discourses. It is written in a beautiful, flowing Nasci Arabic script.
But what's really fascinating is that when a historian looks at this 20-page section, specifically folios 171 note to 181v, the very first thing that jumps out and grabs them by the collar isn't the complex theology. It isn't the arguments about the nature of God. It's the date stamped on the final page.
Right. It is customary for scribes to date their work when they finish copying manuscript. We know from the physical evidence that this manuscript was copied between 1137 and 1139 CE, but the exact date recorded by the scribe on folio 181v is written out explicitly as 11 of Shawwal 533 Hijri,
Okay, let's pause here. For anyone listening who might not be familiar with the terminology, what exactly does Hijri mean in this context?
The Hijri calendar is the Islamic lunar calendar. It operates fundamentally differently from the Gregorian solar calendar we use in the West today. The Gregorian calendar centers on the birth of Jesus as year one.
Right.
The Hijri calendar, however, starts its year one at a completely different historical moment, the year 622 CE.
And what happened in 622?
That was the year the Prophet Muhammad and his early followers emigrated from the city of Mecca to the city of Medina to escape persecution. That emigration is known as the Hijra. So when the scribe writes 533 Hijri, he is saying this was copied 533 lunar years after Muhammad's journey to Medina. For the record, that corresponds to June 11th, 1139 CE in our modern calendar.
This is the contradiction that serves as the entire launch pad for our deep dive today. Let's just sit with this image for a second. You have a deeply Christian text. It's written by a Christian monk who is fiercely defending Christian theology. He is sitting in a Christian monastery.
Yeah.
And yet, when he needs to mark his place in time, he doesn't use the birth of Christ. He uses the defining moment of the Islamic faith. Why?
Well, what's fascinating here is what this single date reveals about the cultural water this monk is swimming in. It represents a massive, total paradigm shift.
It's hard to wrap your head around. It would be like, I don't know, a modern American historian, deeply patriotic, writing a definitive biography of George Washington, but deciding to date the publication using the traditional Chinese dynastic calendar.
That's a great analogy.
It just signals that the dominant cultural framework of your reality has completely undeniably changed.
It does. And this brings up a really intense debate among historians about how we even label this period of time in this geographical region. When scholars talk about the Middle East, North Africa, and the Levant, after the Arab conquests of the 7th century, they often use a very broad brush. They call it the Islamic world.
Which sounds straightforward enough. I mean, Islam was the religion of the rulers, right?
Yes, but it is a flawed term because it implies a religious uniformity that absolutely did not exist on the ground, especially in the first few centuries of Arab rule. In the 8th, 9th, and even into the 10th and 11th centuries, non-Muslims, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, Samaritans often wildly outnumbered the Muslim ruling class in many areas.
So calling the entire region Islamic essentially erases the millions of people who lived there, who kept their own ancient faiths, went to their own churches and synagogues, but were simply operating under new political management.
Precisely. To solve this, a very famous historian named Marshall Hodgson coined the term Islamicate. He wanted a word that described the broader cultural framework, the art, the architecture, the literature that was influenced by Islam, even if the people producing it weren't Muslims themselves. So you could have Islamicate poetry written by a Christian.
It's a good attempt to separate the religion from the culture. But the historical research we're looking at today pushes back even on that term, doesn't it? The scholar prefers a different word altogether.
Yes. Our core source, Claire Wilde, argues that Hijri is actually a much better, more accurate marker for this environment.
Why is Hijri better than Islamicate?
Because Hijri signifies cohabitation and shared public reality, without forcing a religious label onto the culture. Think about it this way. The political state was undeniably dominated by Islam, in the exact same way that medieval Europe was dominated by what we call Christendom.
Right.
But how did that dominance actually manifest in the daily life of a Christian monk? It manifested in the language of the state, which was Arabic, and the timekeeping of the state, which was the Hijri calendar.
Ah, I see. It's about the infrastructure of daily life.
Yeah.
If you went to the market in Jerusalem or Damascus to buy grain, and you looked at the silver dirham or gold dinar in your hand, it had a Hijri date stamped on it.
Exactly.
If you had to sign a legal contract for a piece of land, the notary was going to date it using the Hijri calendar. You couldn't escape it.
You couldn't. It dictated public life. Though calling this monk a Hijri Christian is a brilliant way to describe his reality. He hasn't converted to Islam, but his life, his language, and his concept of time are fundamentally structured by the Hijri reality of the empire he lives in.
You know what this reminds me of? It makes me think of diaspora Judaism. If you look at Jewish communities that lived in Europe or across the Middle East for centuries, they were fundamentally shaped by their host cultures.
Oh, absolutely.
If you look at the Jews of Moorish Spain, they spoke Arabic, they wrote incredible poetry using Arabic meter. Their architecture mirrored Islamic styles. If you look at the Jews of Eastern Europe, they spoke Yiddish, which is heavily influenced by German, and their dress and food adapted to the colder climates and local customs. Yet, despite entirely adopting the cultural clothing of their environment, they retain their core, unbroken religious identity.
That is a perfect parallel. The Christians living under Muslim rule in the Levant and Egypt underwent a very similar process. Over a few generations, they stopped speaking Greek or Aramaic as their primary daily languages and began speaking and writing in Arabic. They structured their civil lives around the Hijri calendar. They were deeply, inextricably embedded in this new Arabic-speaking society, but at their core, in their theology and their worship, they remained fiercely Christian. They adapted everything about their exterior life to protect their interior faith.
Okay, so we have this fascinating concept of a Hijri Christian text. It's written in Arabic, dated on the Islamic calendar, sitting in a fortress monastery in the Sinai desert. Now we need to meet the actual people involved in this manuscript. Who exactly is writing this text, and who are they talking to? Let's set the stage and meet our cast of characters.
So the text is structured as a dialogue, which was a very common and highly respected literary format in classical antiquity and throughout the Middle Ages. You see it from Plato's dialogues all the way through medieval scholasticism. Scholars often refer to this specific genre of text as answers for the sheikh, or sometimes more formally, questions and answers, rational and divine.
And on one side of this dialogue, we have our author. He doesn't give us his name, but we know a fair amount about his identity from his writing. He is an anonymous monk and priest. He belongs to the Melkite Orthodox sect, and we will definitely get into exactly what Melkite means later, because it is crucial to the plot.
Very crucial.
And there are strong textual clues that he is writing from Jerusalem, which he poetically refers to in the text as the city of the Holy House.
And on the other side of this written correspondence is the recipient. The monk addresses him as a noble sheikh.
Now, I have to stop you there. Is this a real person? Because sometimes in these historical philosophical texts, the author just invents a straw man opponent so they can easily knock down their arguments. Is the sheikh just a sock puppet?
It's a great question, and historians debate this constantly. In this case, the sheikh is presented as a very real, devout, practicing Muslim who holds a position of nobility or high social standing. The text implies that this sheikh has approached the monk with genuine, earnest questions about the Christian faith. He wants to understand what the Christians actually believe, directly from a learned priest.
And the monk responds to him with incredible respect, right? It's not a screaming match.
Not at all. The monk employs the highly refined, beautifully ornate style of polite Arabic correspondence. He opens by praising the sheikh's excellent character. He praises his sincere intent in asking these questions. He treats him as an honorable intellectual equal on a mutual quest for truth.
But, and in history there's always a but, the monk makes a very sharp pivot. He maintains all this flowery politeness toward the sheikh, but he makes it crystal clear that he knows where the sheikh actually got these specific questions.
Yes, the monk realizes these aren't just innocent inquiries. He claims the questions the sheikh is asking actually originated from a malicious source. They were pulled from a hostile anti-Christian tract, and the monk doesn't hold back his feelings about the author of that tract. He straight up calls the original author an ignoramus.
I absolutely love the intellectual drama of medieval theological debates. You have this brilliant dynamic where the monk is essentially saying, "My dear, noble, intelligent sheikh, I am so honored by your pure heart and your excellent questions. However, the idiot who wrote the pamphlet you are reading is a complete fool, and I am now going to mathematically and theologically destroy him."
It is a phenomenal rhetorical setup. The monk is maintaining diplomatic immunity with the Muslim authority figure, the sheikh, while simultaneously giving himself permission to absolutely dismantle the opposing arguments with extreme prejudice.
So how does he plan to execute this takedown? He tells the sheikh he is going to rely on two main pillars of argument. The first pillar is what he calls in Arabic, aqliya. What does that mean?
Aqliya translates roughly to rational proofs. This represents human logic, philosophical reasoning, deductions, and analogies drawn from the natural world. It is the realm of the intellect.
And the second pillar is ilahiyya.
Right. Ilahiyya refers to divine proofs. These are the arguments that cannot be deduced by human logic alone. They are God-given examples drawn from divine revelation, scripture, the law, and prophetic sayings. The monk promises the sheikh that he will provide definitive answers drawn from the illuminating books of God.
Okay, here is where the story takes a massive turn. When a Christian monk, sitting in Jerusalem or the Sinai, tells a Muslim that he is going to quote the illuminating books of God to prove that Christianity is the one true religion, you naturally instinctively assume he means the Bible.
Sure, yeah.
He is going to open the Old Testament, he's going to open the Gospels, and he's going to quote Jesus and the prophets.
Well, what's fascinating here is that the anonymous monk flips the script entirely. He doesn't just rely on the Bible. In fact, if he only used the Bible, the Muslim sheikh would probably just dismiss it because Islamic tradition holds that the original Christian texts were corrupted over time.
So the monk has to find a different angle of attack?
He steps directly into the sheikh's own worldview. He crosses the aisle. The monk takes the Islamic holy text, the Qur'an, and he incorporates it into his own arsenal of divine proofs.
Wait, hold on. Let me just pause and make sure I am fully grasping the sheer audacity of this. A Christian monk, sworn to uphold the church, is using the Islamic holy book, the text revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, to try and prove to a Muslim that Jesus is God. Isn't that considered deeply heretical to both sides? How does he even conceptualize doing this, let alone get away with it without being executed for blasphemy?
It requires a level of intellectual bravery and linguistic mastery that is, frankly, astonishing. Which brings us to the core of the manuscript. The monk's execution of this argument is an absolute masterclass in intellectual jujitsu. He is going to use the Qur'an's own words against the standard Islamic interpretation to prove Christian theology.
Before we delve into the exact mechanics of how he pulls off this jujitsu, let's take a quick conversational detour. Just a quick aside for anyone listening. As we get into these intense 12th century religious debates, we are strictly looking at this through the lens of history. We're acting as historical detectives today.
Yes, absolutely.
We are going to be discussing intense theological claims, arguments over the very nature of God, the interpretation of sacred holy texts, and disputes between major world religions. We are neutrally reporting on the historical arguments made by this anonymous Christian monk centuries ago. We are absolutely not taking sides, nor are we endorsing any of the theology from Christianity, Islam, or Judaism. We are just marveling at the intellectual architecture of this manuscript.
Exactly. Our goal is strictly to analyze the how and the why of his arguments as a historical artifact. We are looking at the mechanics of persuasion in the medieval Mediterranean.
And the mechanics are breathtaking. Let's look at the first major hurdle. The monk doesn't just know a few verses of the Qur'an by heart. The historical research highlights his incredibly deep, granular familiarity with tafsir. Now, for a listener who isn't steeped in Islamic studies, what is tafsir, and why is it so wild that a Christian monk knows it?
So tafsir is the traditional Islamic science of exegesis or interpretation of the Qur'an. The Qur'an is often highly poetic, nonlinear, and complex. Over the centuries, Muslim scholars built a massive library of literature explaining the historical context of the verses, the grammatical nuances, and the theological implications.
Right.
To know tafsir means you don't just know what the text says, you know how the greatest minds of the religion argue about what the text says.
It's the difference between having read the Constitution and having a law degree specializing in Supreme Court jurisprudence.
That is a brilliant way to put it. For a Christian monk to have access to this literature and to have studied it deeply enough to weaponize it tells us that the intellectual boundaries in a place like 12th century Jerusalem were incredibly porous. Scholars of different faiths were likely reading each other's books, perhaps debating in the markets or the courts. It was a shared intellectual ecosystem.
So how does he use this insider knowledge to his advantage? Let's look at one of the biggest theological walls between Christianity and Islam, the concept of the incarnation.
Right. Christians believe in the incarnation, the belief that the infinite transcendent God took on human flesh, lived and suffered in the person of Jesus of Nazareth.
But for a Muslim, that idea is entirely fundamentally unacceptable.
Completely. To a Muslim, the idea of God becoming a physical, biological man violates the absolute oneness, the tawhid, and the complete transcendence of God. God does not have a body. God does not bleed. God does not die. So how do you bridge that gap?
The monk points the sheikh to a specific verse in his own book. He points to Surah 42, verse 51 of the Qur'an. What does that verse say?
The verse states that it is not fitting for a human being that God should speak to them directly except by inspiration or from behind a veil. The divine presence is too overwhelming, so there must be a barrier, a veil between God and humanity.
And the monk reads this and says, aha, I completely agree. He seizes on that specific concept of the veil. He tells the sheikh, yes, you are right. The divine essence, which he calls the jawhar, is entirely transcendent and only ever speaks from behind a veil. He then starts listing examples from traditions that both Christians and Muslims share.
Right. He brings up the story of Moses and the burning bush, which is found in both the Bible and the Qur'an. But here is the genius move. He doesn't use the biblical phrasing. He specifically uses the term boxthorn tree.
Why does that matter?
Because boxthorn tree is the exact specific phrase that Muslim scholars use in their tafsir to identify the species of the burning bush. He is signaling to the sheikh, I am not arguing with you from a foreign Christian perspective. I am inside your own theological house using your own furniture.
Wow. He is speaking their language perfectly. He establishes this agreed-upon premise. God speaks from behind a veil, and sometimes that veil is a physical object in the world, like a literal boxthorn tree that is on fire but not consumed. And once the sheikh is nodding his head in agreement, the monk springs the trap.
Yes. He takes that concept and extends it to Jesus. He argues that the physical body of the Messiah is simply the ultimate veil. God is not the flesh, just as God was not the bark and leaves of the boxthorn tree, but God is veiled within the human flesh of Jesus to communicate with humanity.
That's incredible.
He takes a Quranic verse explicitly designed to emphasize God's distance and unimaginability, and he seamlessly re-engineers it to explain the Christian incarnation.
It is a subtle, highly sophisticated rhetorical move. But it's not the only one. Let's talk about the miracles. Both religions agree that Jesus performed massive miracles, right?
Yes. The Quran has deep reverence for Jesus, known as Isa in Arabic. It acknowledges that he was born of a virgin and that he performed incredible miracles, including healing the sick and reviving the dead.
But there is a massive catch.
The catch is the source of the power. The Quran explicitly states in Surah 5, verse 1 and 10, that Jesus did these incredible things by my permission, meaning by God's permission. The Orthodox Islamic view is that Jesus is a mighty human prophet who is empowered by an external God. He has no inherent divine power of his own.
So the monk has to address this. And his solution is basically to edit the Quran right in front of the sheikh's face. He subtly alters the text of the verse. Instead of writing that Jesus revived the dead by God's permission, which in the original Arabic is by idni, the monk tweaks the phrase ever so slightly. He writes that Jesus revived the dead by the power of his divinity, which is by idhan lahuti.
It's a microscopic linguistic shift, but a gargantuan theological one. He corrects the Quran to align with Christian theology, replacing the permission of an external separate God with the inherent internal divine power of Jesus himself.
And he just slips it into the sentence, hoping the sheikh follows the logic. It's incredibly bold. But if you think that's bold, wait until we get to the Trinity.
Oh, the Trinity is perhaps the most difficult concept to defend in this context because the Quran explicitly and directly attacks it. In Surah 5, verse 73, the Quran unequivocally condemns those who say God is the third of three. It is a direct refutation of the Christian doctrine of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
How on earth do you make jujitsu a verse that explicitly calls your core belief a blasphemy?
You use linguistics and history. The scholar Sidney Griffith, who is extensively cited in our research, points out something fascinating about that specific Quranic phrase. The Arabic phrase third of three is actually a Syriacism.
What does that mean, a Syriacism?
Well, Syriac was a dialect of Aramaic that was the primary language of Middle Eastern Christianity for centuries before Arabic took over. Many Christian theological terms in Arabic were borrowed or adapted from older Syriac words. Griffith points out that the Quranic phrase third of three has deep roots in the Syriac word thathaya.
And what does thathaya mean?
It can mean one of a triad, or treble one. In the Syriac Christian tradition, long before Islam, this specific word was formally used to refer to a single hypostasis, or a person of the Trinity.
So the monk, who is clearly multilingual and deeply educated in this history, recognizes this linguistic fingerprint in the Quran. He sees the phrase third of three and thinks, I know where that comes from. And how does he use it?
He links this Quranic critique back to an ancient story in the Old Testament, the story of the guests of Abraham. In the book of Genesis, the patriarch Abraham is visited in the desert by three mysterious men. Since the very early days of the church, Christians have historically interpreted these three visitors as a physical manifestation, a prefigurement of the Trinity.
And here are the crossover. The Quran also tells the story of Abraham's mysterious guests. You can find it in Surah 51.
But the Quranic version of the story has some differences. The Quran doesn't explicitly specify that there were exactly three guests, nor does it give a threefold greeting in the text itself. However, and this is where the monk's knowledge of tafsir comes in again, Islamic tradition, and the commentators did generally understand the guests to be three specific angels, usually identified as Gabriel, Michael, and Raphael.
The monk brilliantly, surgically fuses these two traditions together. He points the sheikh to the Quran's mention of Abraham's guests. He then specifies that there were exactly three of them, pulling from the broader tradition. And he adds a detail, claiming they gave a threefold greeting of peace, 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 or salam, salam, salam.
He is weaving a biblical narrative back into the Quranic text.
Exactly. And then he brings it all home. He argues that these three noble guests mentioned in the Islamic story are the three Aqwanim, which is the Arabic theological term for the hypostases or the distinct persons of the Christian Trinity. He takes a Quranic phrase that was literally designed to attack the Trinity, maps it onto a Quranic story about Abraham, and uses it to prove the truth of the Trinity to a Muslim.
The intellectual acrobatics required to pull that off are staggering. It requires an audience, the sheikh, that is deeply educated just to even follow the leaps the monk is making. He is taking Syriac linguistic roots, ancient biblical typology, direct Quranic text, and Islamic tafsir, and weaving them all into a single, cohesive, inescapable defense.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because if you thought the Abraham argument was wild, the research details the monk's most audacious argument of all. It is genuinely mind-bending. It has to do with the very beginning of the longest chapter in the Quran, Surah 2, known as Surah al-Baqarah.
We need to set the context for this. Several chapters of the Quran do not begin with a standard sentence. They begin with mysterious, disconnected Arabic letters. Surah 2, for example, begins with 3 letters. Alif, Lam, Mim.
Just the letters, no words.
Correct. And for centuries, Muslim scholars have heavily debated the meaning of these disconnected letters. They are largely considered an interpretive puzzle, a profound divine mystery that only God truly understands. Some say they are acronyms, some say they are numerical codes.
The anonymous monk looks at this unsolvable puzzle, Alif Lam Mim, and he basically tells the sheikh, I know exactly what this means, and it proves Christianity.
How does he get there?
He focuses on the last letter, al-Mim. He treats it as a single entity, a standalone symbol. He argues that this letter, the M, stands for the Messiah.
Okay, so he claims it's a divine abbreviation for Jesus. That's a clever trick, but it's not a slam dunk.
The slam dunk comes in how he connects it to the very next sentence. Right after Alif Lam Mim, Surah 2, verse 2 says, that is the book in which there is no doubt.
Now, conventionally, how does a Muslim read that sentence? A Muslim reads that verse as the Quran referring to itself. The Quran is declaring, I am the book in which there is no doubt. It is a statement of its own divine authority.
But the monk stops and argues a point of Arabic grammar. He points out that the text specifically uses the demonstrative pronoun for something distant. It says that book, not this book.
Because it points outward.
Exactly. The monk argues that the Quran is deliberately pointing the reader away from itself. He says the text is saying, look at the abbreviation in the previous verse. Look at the M, the Messiah, that book, the book belonging to the Messiah, which is the Christian gospel. That is the book in which there is no doubt.
He literally argues that the Quran's opening verses are a divine signpost validating the absolute truth of the Christian gospel over the Quran itself.
It is just a stunning, jaw-dropping piece of exegesis. I can only imagine what the sheikh thought when he read that.
What is truly remarkable about this is the tone. As wild as these interpretations are, they aren't delivered as insults. We have other Christian polemicists from this exact era, men like Abd al-Masih al-Kindi, whose writings were highly sensational, deeply aggressive, and often mocked Islam openly to score cheap points with their own followers.
Yeah.
The anonymous monk doesn't do that.
He's incredibly respectful, almost to a fault.
Because his strategy is fundamentally different. He is engaging in what modern scholars call proof texting. He meticulously cherry-picks specific verses, deliberately separates them from their broader Islamic theological context, and massages them until they fit his own theological needs perfectly. He treats the Quran not as a false book, but as a complex puzzle, and he implies that if you solve the puzzle correctly, using Christian logic, it reveals Christian truth.
It looks, on the surface, like the monk is dedicating all this massive intellectual energy, all this linguistic prowess, just to convince one Muslim sheikh. He is translating his ancient faith into the new language of Islam. But if we slow down and look closely at the specific, highly technical vocabulary the monk uses to describe Jesus throughout this text, a hidden layer emerges.
Yes, it does.
It becomes clear he is actually fighting a two-front war. Yes, he's answering the Muslim sheikh, but his other enemy, the people he's really trying to destroy, fellow Christians.
This raises an important question, maybe the most important question of our entire deep dive. Why is the language of this Arabic text so obsessively, painstakingly precise regarding the mechanical nature of Christ's divinity? To understand this hidden war, we have to wind the clock back and look at the theological backdrop of the Christian Mediterranean in the centuries leading up to this manuscript.
Let's go back to the year 451 CE, to the Council of Chalcedon. This is long before Islam even exists. The early Christian church, the superpower of late antiquity, was essentially tearing itself apart from the inside over a question that, to modern ears, might sound incredibly technical. They were fighting over how, exactly, Jesus was both God and man.
Right. The debate centered on the concept of natures. Jesus is divine, and Jesus is human. But how do those two realities coexist in one body? Were his divine and human natures entirely separate, like oil and water, or were they united, blended into one entirely new nature?
Hundreds of bishops gathered at Chalcedon to hash this out. And it wasn't a polite debate. People were excommunicated, exiled, and killed over these definitions. The Council of Chalcedon finally attempted to settle the matter by issuing a declaration. They proclaimed that Jesus had two distinct natures, one entirely divine, one entirely human, and they were united in a single person, without confusion, without change, without division, and without separation.
Christians who accepted this specific view, which included the powerful Byzantine emperors in Constantinople and our anonymous monk, were called Chalcedonians. They are also referred to theologically as diophysites, which literally means two natures in Greek.
In the Arabic-speaking world, this group became known by a specific political nickname, the Melkites. This comes from the Syriac word malka, meaning king or emperor. They were the king's men. They were the favored elite class because they followed the official, state-sponsored theology of the Byzantine emperor.
But here's the massive problem. A huge portion of the Christian population, particularly the vibrant ancient communities in Egypt and Syria, completely rejected the Council of Chalcedon. They looked at the two natures definition and thought it sounded like heresy. They believed that emphasizing two distinct natures risks splitting Christ into two separate beings, almost like a divine schizophrenia.
They preferred a different model.
Yes. They preferred to emphasize the profound oneness and unity of Christ's nature. They argued that in the Incarnation, the divine and human were inextricably united into one single nature of the Word made flesh. For a long time, historians called them monophysites, which means one nature, but modern scholars and the communities themselves strongly prefer the term miaphysites, implying a unified nature.
These non-Chalcedonian Christians were the Copts in Egypt and the Jacobites in Syria, and they fiercely hated the Melkites, and the Melkites fiercely hated them back. It was a bitter, violent, centuries-long rivalry over who represented true Christianity.
The Byzantine emperors, desperate to keep their vast empire from splintering apart over this theological civil war, kept trying to force these groups to compromise. They needed a theological middle ground to hold the state together. So in the 7th century, the state proposed a new compromise doctrine. They said, okay, maybe Christ had two distinct natures, as Chalcedon said, but perhaps those two natures only shared one single will or one single mode of action.
Let's find a middle path. But compromises in theology rarely make anyone happy. Which brings us to a crucial historical figure named Maximus the Confessor.
Maximus was a brilliant, fiercely uncompromising Byzantine monk. He looked at this state-sponsored compromise of one will and absolutely rejected it. He championed the strictest possible diophysite view. He argued that if Jesus truly had two complete natures, human and divine, then logic dictates he absolutely must have two distinct wills and two modes of action. To have a human nature without a human will isn't truly human.
Maximus refused to back down, and the Byzantine authorities punished him brutally for his defiance. They wanted to silence him permanently. In the year 662 CE, he was arrested and put on trial. The state ordered his tongue to be cut out so he could never again speak his two actions theology, and they ordered his right hand to be cut off so he could never again write it.
It was a horrific mutilation. He was sent into exile and died shortly after. However, the wheel of history turned. A couple of decades after his gruesome death, the official church councils vindicated his views. His theology triumphed. He became a legendary hero, a martyr-like figure, a confessor for the Melkite Orthodox faith.
Okay, so we have established this intense, bloody, intra-Christian feud over whether Jesus has two natures and two modes of action. Now let's fast forward and look back at our 12th century manuscript, Sinai R 434, written by our anonymous monk to a Muslim sheikh.
Right.
Throughout the text, the monk insists, repeatedly and forcefully, that Jesus operates with two modes of action, which he translates into the Arabic word philein. And he insists Jesus has two natures, using the Arabic word tabin, which he says are completely unmingled and unmixed.
Which is pure, unadulterated 7th century Greek theology straight from the mind of Maximus the Confessor, translated perfectly into Arabic.
But wait a minute, let me stop right here, because this is where I am genuinely confused. I have to ask, why on earth is the monk writing to a Muslim sheikh about whether Jesus had two modes of action? Think about the audience. The Muslim sheikh doesn't believe Jesus is divine at all. He thinks Jesus is merely a human prophet.
Yeah.
If you are trying to convince a Muslim that Jesus is God, why are you splitting hairs over the highly technical, internal Christian mechanics of how he is God? It makes no sense. It's like arguing with someone who doesn't even believe cars exist about whether your imaginary car has a manual or automatic transmission. Why waste the ink?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the answer becomes incredibly clear, and it is entirely political. It has everything to do with the massive socio-political fallout of the Arab conquests.
So the conquests fundamentally changed the balance of power on the ground.
Entirely. Think about the world before the conquests. Under Byzantine rule, the Melkites, our monks' ancestors, were the favored, powerful elite. The state apparatus, the military, the tax collectors, they all enforced Melkite theology. The Copts and Jacobites were marginalized, treated as second-class citizens, and often persecuted as dangerous heretics.
The Melkites were the top of the food chain.
But then, in the 7th century, the armies of Islam swept out of the Arabian Peninsula. They conquered Syria, they took Jerusalem, they took Egypt. The Byzantine Empire was pushed back into Anatolia, and the arrival of these new Arab rulers inadvertently leveled the Christian playing field.
How so?
Because to the new Muslim caliphs, the intricate nuances of Christian theology were completely irrelevant. The caliph didn't care if you believed in one nature, two natures, one will, or two wills. To the Islamic State, if you believed Jesus was the Son of God, you were wrong either way.
You're all just equally incorrect in the eyes of the new law.
Exactly. Suddenly, the massive Byzantine state apparatus that had artificially propped up the Melkites was gone. A heretic was just a heretic. And this meant that the historically marginalized groups, the Miaphysite Copts and Jacobites, suddenly had an equal chance to jockey for favor, for administrative positions, and for cultural influence with the new Islamic caliphate.
They were all reduced to the same legal status. They were all dhimmi-protected non-Muslim minorities paying a special tax competing for the exact same limited resources and the ear of the emir.
And as the decades passed, particularly after the massive administrative reforms of the Caliph Abd al-Malik in the late 7th century, the Melkites really began to lose their traditional iron grip on power in major cities like Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem. The Jacobites and the Copts were gaining ground. They were building new churches, getting closer to the Arab rulers, and asserting their own power.
The puzzle pieces are snapping together. So the monk isn't just writing this incredibly dense theological treatise to convince the Muslim sheikh. The sheikh isn't the only target.
The sheikh might just be a rhetorical framing device. It's a stage play. By writing a very public, highly intellectual defense of Christianity addressed to a prominent Muslim leader, and then deliberately embedding the strictest, most unyielding Melkite Maximian theology deep into the arguments, the monk is sending a message to everyone else.
He is asserting dominance. He was signaling to the Muslim authorities, and more importantly to his rival Christians, that the Melkite way is the only true, intellectually rigorous, Orthodox Christian way.
He is essentially dunking on his Christian rivals while pretending to have a polite conversation with a Muslim. He is saying, look at how robust, how rational, how philosophically sound our specific version of Christianity is. We can defend it using your own Qur'an. We are the true representatives of this faith, not those other guys.
It is a profound realization about how history works. The violent debates of the 5th and 6th centuries didn't just end or disappear when the Arab conquest happened. They just mutated. The theological civil war survived. The battleground simply shifted from Greek to Arabic, and the audience expanded from the Byzantine emperor to include the new Muslim overlords.
It's an incredible display of intellectual survival, but to pull off this incredibly complex, multi-layered argument, appealing to Muslims through Quranic tafsir while simultaneously attacking rival Christians using 500-year-old Byzantine theology, the monk needs an expansive toolkit. He can't just rely on scripture. He needs a way to bridge human logic and divine mystery. He needs a universal language of reason.
And that brings us to the third major element of his argument, and perhaps the most surprising inclusion in a manuscript from a desert monastery: the ancient Greek philosophers.
We mentioned earlier that the monk relied on a pillar of argument called akliya, which means rational proofs derived from human reason. In the Mediterranean world of late antiquity and the Middle Ages, regardless of whether you were Christian, Jewish, or Muslim, human reason was virtually synonymous with the ancient Greek philosophical tradition.
And the monk doesn't shy away from using the Greeks. In fact, he elevates them to an incredibly high status. He invokes the Greek philosophers and explicitly describes their logical insights as inspired prophecy by a non-prophet. Wait, A Christian monk is calling a pagan Greek philosopher a prophet.
He is putting the likes of Socrates on a pedestal right next to biblical figures. He is arguing that God, in his infinite wisdom, granted these pagan thinkers a sliver of genuine divine truth through the power of reason long before the incarnation.
It's a very generous, incredibly expansive view of how God communicates with humanity. He cites famous historical figures to back up his points. Socrates, Hippocrates, the great cynic Diogenes, but he also goes into more esoteric territory. He cites Hermes Trismegistus.
Hermes Trismegistus is a fascinating figure. He is a legendary, syncretic Hellenistic character, a combination of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. He was associated with ancient, primordial wisdom, alchemy, and magic. The monk even takes the time to explain the Greek etymological meaning of Hermes' name in Arabic for his readers, showing off his linguistic skills.
He also cites a very mysterious text called Kitab al-Saba Ajar, which translates to the Book of the Seven Stones. The historical research notes that this was likely an Arabic translation of a lost Greek text belonging to that esoteric Hermetic tradition. He is pulling from deep, obscure, almost magical knowledge to back up his theological points.
And he isn't just dropping their names to sound smart or well-read, he is actively deploying their philosophical frameworks. To explain the Trinity and the dual nature of Christ concepts that seem completely mathematically illogical to a strict monotheist like a Muslim, he uses analogies drawn directly from the natural world. This is a classic foundational technique in Greek philosophy and early church patristic thought.
Let's walk through some of these natural analogies because they are genuinely beautiful and they help us visualize the complex theology. To explain the Trinity, how God can be one single essence but simultaneously three distinct persons, he uses the analogy of the sun.
A classic.
He tells the sheikh, imagine the triune divinity is like the sun in the sky. It is one object. But from the sun, light is born, and from it, heat emanates. The sun itself, the light you see, and the heat you feel on your skin are three distinct things with distinct properties, yet they do not divide or change the singular underlying nature of the star.
It's an elegant, universally understandable way to explain the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit sharing one unchangeable divine essence.
He uses another one that I love, the analogy of the sea. He says, imagine taking 3 drops of water from 3 entirely different seas. You might call one drop the Mediterranean, you call the second drop the Red Sea, and you call the third the Black Sea. The names differ based on their expression. But if you hold those 3 drops in the palm of your hand, their inherent nature, their jawar, their essence, which is water, is exactly undeniably the same. One essence, 3 distinct expressions.
And when it comes to defending the hardest concept of all, the two natures of Christ, the strict Diophysite view that caused Maximus the Confessor to lose his tongue, he uses an analogy that was actually heavily favored by Maximus himself centuries earlier. He uses the analogy of fire and iron.
Yes, this one is so visceral. He tells the sheikh, imagine the union of God and man is like putting a cold iron sword into a blazing blacksmith's forge. When you pull it out, the iron is glowing red hot. It is completely, totally infused with fire. The fire and the iron are intimately, intensely united. They act together simultaneously to burn and to cut. Yet, despite being united in a single glowing object, they remain fundamentally distinct in their nature.
The iron doesn't magically become fire, and the fire doesn't become iron.
Exactly. They are, to use his exact Melkite terminology, unmingled and unmixed.
What's fascinating here is what this reveals about the monk's own personal education. He is casually dropping highly specific Maximian concepts and Greek philosophical analogies into an Arabic text addressed to a Muslim. This strongly suggests he wasn't just relying on later, watered-down Arabic summaries of Greek thought. He or his immediate teachers were likely reading the original Greek texts.
And his linguistic flexing doesn't stop at Greek and Arabic.
Yeah.
He brings Hebrew into the mix, too. Right in the middle of this flowing Arabic manuscript, he uses transliterated Hebrew to prove the Trinity.
Transliteration is a key detail. He writes the phonetic sounds of the Hebrew Bible, but he spells them out using the Arabic alphabet.
He writes, I am who I am, Adonai, Elohim. By using the plural Hebrew word for God, Elohim, he is trying to prove that the plurality of the Trinity is baked into the original language of Revelation. But think about what it means to do that physically on the page. He is switching alphabets in his brain to make a theological point.
This tells historians so much about the provenance and the environment of the manuscript. The research argues that this specific level of linguistic dexterity, a single author moving seamlessly and confidently between Arabic, Greek, Syriac concepts, and Hebrew transliteration points heavily to Jerusalem or the broader region of Palestine as the place of composition.
It was an absolute melting pot, a
Oh.
crossroads of empires and languages.
Exactly. Jerusalem remained an incredibly vibrant hub of Greco-Arabic bilingualism well into the 12th and 13th centuries. The monk is operating at the absolute zenith of what they call the divine sciences. He is synthesizing the deepest intellectual traditions of four entirely different languages to defend a highly specific Christian sect while living inside an Islamic empire.
So what does this all mean? We've spent all this time dissecting the intricate arguments of a nameless monk who lived almost 1,000 years ago, sitting in the dust of the Sinai desert or walking the crowded, chaotic streets of medieval Jerusalem. Why should you, listening to this today, care about Sinai R434?
Because it is a profound masterclass in how human knowledge and human identity survive the rise and fall of empires. It's a testament to ultimate intellectual resilience.
Think about the trauma his community went through. The Byzantine Empire, the massive Christian superpower that protected his faith and his social status, was violently pushed out. The entire culture shifted overnight. The primary language of his world changed. The calendar he used to mark his days changed. The coins in his pocket changed. The easy thing to do, the natural defensive human reaction, would be to retreat into a shell, to lock the monastery doors, refuse to speak a word of Arabic, and simply wait in the dark for the end of the world.
But he didn't do that. He engaged with reality. He learned the new language of power. He mastered the new dominant text, the Qur'ān. He studied the intricate exegesis of his rulers. He took the intellectual tools of his conquerors and fused them with the ancient philosophy of the Greeks to defend his deeply held beliefs. He didn't just survive in the Hijri Mediterranean, he competed in it, fiercely and brilliantly.
He adapted everything about his exterior life without ever surrendering his core interior identity. But that brings up a really fascinating, almost dangerous psychological tension in his work. And it's something I want to leave you with to ponder as we wrap up. The historical research notes that the monk has a remarkably liberal understanding of revelation. We've seen it. He is willing to take the Islamic Qur'an and place it squarely among the books of God. He is willing to look at pagan Greek philosophers and elevate them to the status of inspired prophets.
He is stretching the boundaries of his own Orthodox tradition almost to the breaking point just to win an argument.
Exactly. So here is the thought to mull over, and it's a question about the nature of the human mind. When you spend your entire life deeply studying your opponent's worldview, when you spend decades reading their holy books, mastering their interpretive methods, learning to think exactly like them just so you can argue against them more effectively, does that framework inevitably start to rewrite your own mind?
It's the abyss staring back. You cannot handle a text that intimately you cannot live inside another culture's paradigm for that long without it leaving a permanent mark on your own psychology.
Right. By treating the Qur'an as a legitimate, reliable source of divine proof texting, did this anonymous Melkite monk inadvertently cross an invisible theological line? Did he, in his brilliant, desperate effort to win a debate and assert his own supremacy, actually end up creating a strange, hybrid faith in his own mind? Did he build a version of Christianity that eventually relied on the Qur'an to make sense of itself? It's something to mull over.
A profound question about the nature of dialogue, adaptation, and what it truly means to believe.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fortress of the Sinai, the shifting sands of the Hijri Mediterranean, and the brilliant, adaptable mind of the anonymous monk.